Governments should not be able to shut down or block open communication systems. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. This one is beyond critical, and I've been compiling notes for a few days on this one, as I do for a lot of my different segments, but I like to think about these things. And there were two articles, one in CNN by Ivana Katsova, Max Saltman, Kosta Gak, and Anna Chernova, as well as another one from Tom's Hardware, another article from Joey Morales. Now, here's what's going on as a backdrop to this conversation, and let's start with that CNN article, because Russian authorities have begun restricting access to Telegram. Now, Telegram is one of Russia's most popular social media apps, and essentially, their government is essentially trying to push everyday Russians towards its own tightly controlled alternatives to foreign tech platforms. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this. So this past Tuesday, the government said that it was restricting access to Telegram for the, quote, protection of Russian citizens. They also accused the app of of refusing to block content authorities consider criminal and terrorist, quote unquote. Russia's telecommunications regulator, Roskomnadzor, basically said in a statement that it would continue to restrict the operation of Telegram and the operation thereof, basically, quote, until violations of Russian law are eliminated, end quote. Now, Roskomnadzor also continued, and I quote, personal data is not protected, and there are no effective measures to counter fraud or the use of the messaging service for criminal and terrorist purposes, end quote. Telegram rejects this claim, saying that essentially they actively combat the harmful use, in such ways on their platforms. And then there's the Dutch. And for that, we're going to go to that Tom's Hardware article, because if you didn't know this, Canadian-based Windscribe, they are a VPN provider, just said that one of their European servers has allegedly been seized by Dutch authorities without a warrant. So, according to the company's post on X, formerly Twitter, law enforcement said that they will return it to the service provider after they, quote, fully analyze it. Now, it's unclear why law enforcement impounded just a single rack from Windscribe's cabinet, but the VPN provider said that it only uses RAM disk servers. Now, what this means is that anybody who would look through the actual installed hard drives or SSDs into this server would only find essentially the install of the operating system, in this case Ubuntu, on it. So the servers shouldn't hold any traceable data. A lot of VPN providers run in this manner specifically to ensure the privacy of their users. So it's unclear what the Dutch authorities seek from Windscribe servers, but the company said in a subsequent post on X that it gets a, quote, handful of law enforcement requests every month, end quote, and that it always responds with, quote unquote, we have no logs. Again, very typical for most actual private VPN providers out there. However, the company also claims that the authorities did not ask this time, saying that, quote, they just snatched the server from the rack to look for the logs themselves, end quote. The Netherlands is a democracy, right? A representative democracy, but it's a democracy. So that's obviously a huge issue. And so this is the backdrop here. And I think it's important to discuss some core fundamental issues here, focusing more on Russia's Telegram situation, but we're also going to apply this to the Dutch and any government system that we've got, because we have two really core competing governmental systems around the world. We have authoritarianism and we have democracy. I like to say that cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're definitely not immune from it. And this is exactly the case that we are talking about here. So the first point I want to make is that freedom of expression and privacy are foundational rights. It's not just an American thing or a democratic thing. It is essentially a fundamental human right. Shutting down or throttling open communication systems like a Telegram undermines freedom of speech and expression, which are protected civil liberties in democratic constitutions, right? It's also protected by international law. Restrictions on communication, such as blocking, throttling, forced data disclosures, really do hinder legitimate discourse. They also hinder dissent, private communications, and a whole bunch more. This seriously harms civic engagement and public debate. And my next point is simply that democratic governance preserves the plurality of ideas. It's one of the things that basically allows democracies to advance and innovate. Democracies rely on pluralistic exchanges of information where citizens can debate, they can criticize, but most importantly, they can also hold power to account. Under the U.S. Constitution, you have a right to redress of grievances against the government. That is a fundamental expression that all humans should have. Just a good example is the U.S. Constitution. Authoritarian systems, though, like Russia's, frequently use communication shutdowns and censorship to curtail dissent and also consolidate power. They're not there to protect public safety. And in Russia's case, the measures to restrict Telegram really align with Russia's broader patterns of internet isolation and controls of digital platforms. You might remember shortly before the Ukraine war, all of Russia shut down internet to the outside world as a test to see if they could actually sustain internal systems and operate without gaining access or having the outside world hit Russian servers. And my next point here is simply that open platforms support accountability and transparency. It may seem counterintuitive, but independent messaging channels are often used by journalists, civil society, and oversight bodies to essentially share information and document abuses. In authoritarian contexts, shutting them down forecloses independent reporting and basically facilitates state propaganda, something that Russia has been incredibly good at, whether they were communist or not. And the next point is that I think there is basically collateral damage to everyday life. For hopefully not you and I, but definitely for Russian citizens right now, because blocking or degrading access to large communication platforms like Telegram affects ordinary citizens' ability to communicate, possibly conduct business, access public services, if the public services are using them to disperse information, and also just simply remain informed. Right? This is not just a bad actors situation, as Russia likes to claim. Reports show widespread disruptions to Telegram services in Russia when the throttling actually began, with users reporting connectivity issues, reduced performance, and more. And that just hinders them, right? Which leads us to the next point, because the other side of this is state alternatives to private platforms. But that vastly increases surveillance risks. State-mandated alternatives, like I mentioned earlier on, and Russia has one of those, it's known as the Max app. They're oftentimes designed for surveillance and political control rather than user privacy. So this creates a privacy cost that essentially outweighs any claimed public safety benefits and strengthens state power over personal data and communications. That's a huge issue because this seriously, and this is my next point, this is seriously ineffective at stopping crime, but it's incredibly powerful at silencing dissent and opinion. It's a huge problem. Open platforms can be misused for illicit activity. We all know this. There's literal war crimes happening on Facebook that they really haven't curtailed, but blanket restrictions are essentially blunt instruments for governments to leverage. They punish all users rather than targeting genuine criminal behavior. It's like making laws to the lowest common denominator. I talk about this all the time. Human rights groups have asserted that measures like throttling or blocking, in this case Telegram, in Russia, are not proportional to the stated aim of actually preventing fraud or crime. Rather, they're part of a broader repression toolkit that Russia has tended to leverage at will over the years as President Putin has been in power. Arbitrary shutdowns weaken legal protections. That's really what this comes down to, and that's my next point, because democratic societies demand clear legal standards. They demand proportionality, judicial oversight. They demand independent review for any restriction on a core freedom. If we are going to limit what free speech is, for example, in the United States, the First Amendment, there has to be clear decisions. There has to be weigh-ins. The Supreme Court says, yes, we have a right to free speech, but that doesn't mean you can yell fire in a crowded movie theater, right? You just don't simply restrict all speech. There's a check and a balance that happens there. But authoritarian shutdown, their shutdowns lack these kinds of safeguards. And without transparent criteria and due process, government authority to shut down communication systems, as I mentioned before, is again just a tool for political repression. It has nothing to do with public safety. And so that simply leads to our next point, which is that this is an erosion of trust between citizens and government. And it's playing out in Russia and has been for quite some time. When governments shut down communication tools, they risk eroding public trust. This is especially true among marginalized groups who may rely on open platforms for community organizing, access to information, and more. This is essentially what they are doing, is isolating and therefore hindering. It's a huge issue. And it's also precedent setting, which is my next point, right? Because if democracies start adopting broad authority to shut down services like a Telegram or a Signal or a Facebook or whatever it is, they inadvertently validate authoritarian models of internet control. Think about China's Great Firewall or the constant internet blackouts that Iran has been going through, as there is almost next to a revolution happening in that country, where we're finding out that thousands of casualties at the hands of the state are occurring as they are blacking out basically the internet so that their citizens cannot coordinate or communicate with each other. This essentially is weakening international norms around digital freedoms. This is something that we cannot, as just human beings, allow. It's a huge problem. And the last point I want to make here is that internet freedom, just in general, internet freedom is absolutely a competitive advantage for open societies versus authoritarianism and authoritarian societies. Open communication supports economic activity. It supports innovation. Cross-border collaboration is so unbelievably important. I mean, look at the free trade that has happened, just outside of the internet between North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. If I'm going from north to south, and the free and open borders to do things like, build cars in Canada that are primarily sold in the United States. The Canadians become very good at building cars or aerospace. And also the Mexicans became very good at building this with qualified labor. And we are moving things back and forth. And what the United States is experts at gets exported to Canada and Mexico as well. A rising tide raises all boats. And it's the same on the internet. And so internet censorship and platform shutdowns can isolate populations economically as well as socially. This is a huge issue that we have. And while I'm talking about primarily Russia here, given that they are an authoritarian state, if the Dutch are essentially seizing servers, and again, they're part of the European Union, they're part of the Schengen area, they are a democratic-based society. If they're able to do this with, let's say, no laws or oversight to this, no recourse against that hinders all of us because that becomes acceptable. It's the same as the argument for breaking encryption. Every major government out there, United States, EU, etc., want backdoors into encryption for the lowest common denominator. Most of us, 99.99% of us, are not criminals. We're not terrorists online. We're not kidnapping children. So why should our privacy be eroded? And we have had law enforcement play the cat and mouse game, with cops and robbers, in time immemorial. And essentially, if they had a safe 100 years ago, they'd have to break into the safe to get, whatever was stolen, in the same way you'd have to break into these things. But at the end of the day, my safe should still be my safe. My safe should not have some universal lock, or unlock that law enforcement can use. And that's what we're talking about here. So this is a huge issue. It's not going away anytime soon, but I'm arguing here that essentially we need to look at the Russian situation, we need to look at that Dutch situation, and we need to be vocal about this, and we need to be petitioning governments, and we need to basically be working within systems to ensure that we have better and more safeguards around these open platforms and systems. And now, if you're a longtime listener and follower of mine, I have taken Facebook and social media to task left and right. But at the end of the day, while I fundamentally want to see them changed and changed for the better because their algorithms are basically prioritizing anger, which has caused mental depression, especially in younger generations, I want to work within the system to ensure that we have something that's fair and balanced, that we're not hindering communications while we are trying to help citizens as well. There has to be a balance, but to give a government the authority to blanketly say, no, we're just going to shut this down with no legal proceedings, no oversight, no filtering, anything like that, that's where we seem to be heading as we are basically creating surveillance states, massive surveillance states, even in countries that have been historically democratic. This is all moving in the wrong direction. And so I'll leave it at that. But I think this is one of the big issues for our time. And if you're in one of those countries where your government is doing that, I am sorry, but now's the time to get vocal. And getting vocal in an authoritarian state is not typically a recommended activity, especially if you're one voice. But in a democratic state, absolutely. So that is your deep dive. Best of luck to us all. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I'm going to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.